What's up, everybody? I'm John Middlekauff. You know what I need you to do. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got content for days reacting to every NFL game all the time, every single day. Subscribe, like the videos. Let's go. Middlekauff Mailbag. You guys know the drill. At John Middlekauff is my Instagram. Fire in those DMs. At John Middlekauff is my Instagram. DMs wide open. Fire away and get your questions answered on the show. We will start with Austin. During the offseason, I see so many accounts talking about PFF grades and RAS scores. As a former college baseball coach, I do love metrics and stats. But to me, if all someone can talk about are the scores grades, I question if they actually know what they're talking about. These are cool, but I think they should only be a part of the puzzle. As a former scout, I'm curious how much stock you take in a guy's metrics and which ones you think are important. I think the number one key to the scores, right, like where you rank at your position group historically, are comps. So if I get a guy that I think is an excellent prospect, let's just say like a second rounder, but his measurables and his test scores are not good. Well, you go, well, who is his comparison? Has anyone with these test scores of height, weight, speed, agility, you name it, have never met these numbers? We got to do some reevaluation, and vice versa, because I think a lot of times you got a lot of good athletes playing college football. So some guys might not be great football players, but they do the testing and they're really good. And sometimes those people are poor coaching in college. For whatever reason, it never materialized. And you can be open to taking those guys late in the draft. But how often do we see in the first couple rounds where you go, this guy wasn't that good in college, but he tests well? And I also think certain individuals set off alarms when you're just kind of a mid prospect, like you may be a draftable guy, and then you test really well. So I think it just forces you to reevaluate stuff. But like there are some scores that matter. You can't be a 4.7 corner. Like that's not going to work. You can't have really, really short arms and play tackle. It's going to be impossible. Right? And there's a line of like, well, are Will Campbell's too short, or are there been a couple examples of him being able to do it? And he's probably right on the edge, just like small hands. Small hands at quarterback aren't the end all be all, but you do see it come up. Brock Purdy, smaller hands, struggles to hold the ball in inclement weather. Jared Goff, same thing. Derek Carr, same thing. It's harder to hold the ball in a driving rainstorm if your hands aren't as big. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be good or be successful, but I think, and then there are also guys that are just really good players, but they're just a 6 foot D tackle, right? But if you watch them on tape, like Jesus, and then you end up getting that guy in the third or fourth round. So I think the scores are almost like a, I use the housing analogy a lot, but like they are the check marks of different things. Like how many square foot your house? How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? How big's your garage? It doesn't mean it might not check all those boxes. And it may be a great house. Just like some of your scores and some of your measurables might not be great. But if you're good on tape, like, yeah, we'll draft you. But you might not get drafted as high. In the best case scenario, you check both boxes. You're an elite player and your measurables and testing scores are out of this world. So I don't think, listen, this is difficult because you're dealing with human beings. And at the end of the day, there's no way to measure who's got that dog in them. And that separates a lot of guys. Because by the time, I mean, we're talking about a guy, listen, the end of a draft is a crapshoot, the sixth, seventh round. But when you're talking about the top 100 guys in a draft, like most of them have played at a really high level, have produced, meet a lot of measurables. Like what separates those guys over the course of the next 7, 8 years? A lot of variables. And if people had the answers, they would never miss. So I think they try to take all those ingredients. The tape is always going to be the most important thing. The scores, the interviews, the interactions, what people have said about you from a scouting standpoint, your coaches, your assistant coaches, your coordinators, your teammates, your your academic advisors, right? So you just try to factor that all in and make the best decision possible. Because for the most part, especially once you get out of the first round, like there are going to be question marks with every player. There are going to be question marks with every player. And there are question marks with first round players too. But the longer you go, like once you're picking in the late second, third, fourth round, you could pick typically between several guys at every spot. It's hard. And you just try to make the most educated guess you can make. It's why I think teams that draft really well have a really good feel for the type people they like. Like the Ravens, they know what they're looking for, right? The Chiefs have a pretty good idea what they're looking for. The Rams now feels like they're pretty dialed on the human as much as the player. Can you make it make sense? I live in a state where you cannot gamble on the games, but I can gamble if Luca will score 30 points or if I think an NFL quarterback will throw a bunch of interceptions. Why is it legal for that to be allowed for us to gamble on that, but not the actual games? I don't know, man. I think I think I know the companies you're talking about. I've lived in Arizona now for whatever 3 years, so I have no issues with the DraftKings app. Use it a lot. Uh, I think they've been able to like fall under the fantasy football category, which it's not fantasy football betting on how. I mean, that's I can gamble on that too on DraftKings, right? I do props. You can do over unders. I've tried a couple times on basketball points, and I've never got it right. Like, oh, Steph Curry, 22.5. I'll hit this easy. And then he like going into the last 5 minutes, he's got like 16 points. But I'm with you. It's pretty stupid. I've been hearing a lot of concerns about Jeanty's height, but is height really a big factor at running back? If anything, wouldn't you want my running back? I wouldn't want my running back to be too tall because he would get tackled easily. Jeanty being 5'8" could be an advantage because his lower center of gravity, you see the way he bounces off tackles. I just feel if I was a GM, I would look at a few other factors before height. A lot of the greatest running backs of all time aren't even 6 foot. Again, this gets back to that score thing. You'd have to look in the history of the NFL. When's the last time a guy under 5'9" dominated at running back and got drafted really high? There aren't that many comps. So when I look at he's smaller, but one guy that I look back at was Darren Sproles, who was a dominant college player, who his junior year at Kansas State ran for 2,000 yards and 16 touchdowns. Hell, his sophomore year he ran for 1,500 yards and 17 touchdowns. His last 3 years, he had 46 touchdowns, and that's just rushing the ball. And he's smaller than Jeanty. He's 5'6", but like was an elite player. And we discriminated a lot more 20 years ago against height, but he went in the fourth round. Now, modern day, because Sproles could catch, he would go on. He would go on the second day of the draft. But you look at these comps, you go, well, think of the star running backs in the NFL. Just over the last like 20 years. LaDainian Tomlinson, Marshall Faulk, Adrian Peterson, Saquon, McCaffrey. You just look at some of the guys. They weren't short. Like they weren't 5'8" short. Now they might be 5'10" or 5'11". I'm with you. You don't need to be Derrick Henry. You don't need to be Adrian Peterson. But Jeanty is closer to Darren Sproles than he is Saquon Barkley. And the other thing is, all these guys I'm listing, right? Adrian Peterson, Saquon Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, they played against NFL players most weeks. Jeanty, for the most part, was just playing against New Mexico and Fresno State. Now, he had a great game against Oregon, so that really works in his favor. But if you want to take him in the first round, I'm not arguing against taking this guy in the first round. We're talking, I get asked about like, should the Raiders take him at 6 overall? Should the Bears take him at 10 overall? And I just say, hey, we got to pump the brakes. And again, if he becomes a superstar, no one will say anything. But if he's just okay or just even just a solid player, that pick will look insane. And that's my only take. I am pro. He was my favorite player to watch this year. He was awesome. I went out of my way to watch Boise State play. What he was doing was stupid. But like playing New Mexico, playing San Diego State just isn't the same as playing Penn State every week. And we saw it. Now, granted, his offensive line, if he would have, I would feel much better about Jeanty, and I respect him for doing this. He stayed at Boise, and his coach even said he passed up a lot of money. I think they paid him like 300 grand, which again is a lot. He was being offered like I think 7 figures to go to the sweet schools. The schools like in the Final Four. And if he had done what he did even 70, 80% at Texas or at Alabama or at Ohio State or wherever, I think you would feel much more, or Oregon, much more confident about taking him really high because every single week the level of competition. And maybe he's proven he's awesome. Now, this guy got banged up, but I was around when I was at Fresno State, Ryan Matthews, who was a fucking tank, who was 5'11, just jacked. I mean, 220 pounds and could run a 4.4. And when he was healthy, dominated whoever we played. And I was there. We were playing the Brian Kelly Cincinnati teams, UCLA, Wisconsin, like playing good teams. Boise State, who at the time was like a top 10 program. And I think Ryan ran for like 200 yards against them. But then he got to the NFL and he got hurt a lot. And maybe he was just a guy that was going to be injured a lot. Or maybe it's like, well, he never, if he would have played at like in the Pac-12 or the Big Ten, maybe his body would have been more accustomed to it. I I just bring that up because I know those are the questions being asked, and I feel like I'm going to come off as a hater, and I am not. I love the player, but I think taking him really high in the draft is insane. It really is. Uh, Let me look at Jameer Gibbs because I liked when the Lions, again, bad draft, a little like this. And Jameer Gibbs, who, was 5'9" and a half, 200 pounds. Now, he ran a 4.36. So his college production looked nothing like Jeanty, was not nearly as good. He started at Georgia Tech and then where I think he backed up Jordan Mason, who the 49ers just traded to Minnesota. So he was part, and then he transferred to Alabama, where he was like a part-time player. I mean, played a lot, but didn't run for 1,000 yards, but caught 44 balls. So when you look at Ashton Jeanty, who I don't think ran at the combine, I don't know when his pro day is. Yeah, he didn't do any of that stuff. Now he's thicker than Jameer, but Jameer went 12, elite speed, elite speed, and can really catch the ball. Smaller player and a little, little taller, but essentially very similar sizes. If you tell me Ashton Jeanty runs a 4.36, you can take him at 12. I have no problem. And listen, he's clearly pretty fast. Jameer Gibbs was flying. 4.36 NFL Combine, not bad. That's how you get drafted at 12. Now, here's the other thing the Lions did. They traded from 6 to 12, so they essentially got Gibbs and Laporta with that pick. Do you think the NFL or college football is a better business? Personally, I think it's college. Payroll, including NIL, isn't even comparable. College football has the same revenue channels, but the NFL makes dramatically more money. Plus, college football is all split up. And college football, as it's set up right now, I have to give money to women's soccer and men's baseball and lacrosse. The NFL makes dramatically more, only has 32 teams in the partnership, and doesn't give any of the money to any other sports. There is no such thing as Title IX in the NFL. Title IX is known as the owner's yacht. So it's They're not comparable businesses. There are way more teams in college, a lot more teams that don't generate the revenue that get to leech off it. Uh, the NFL is just it's just an incredible business right now. Man, there's no way around it. Um, talk about this on the pod. So he sent me this DraftKings picture of Rick Pitino. How everywhere he went within a couple years they dominated. People often disregard basketball coaches as the least important in sports. Some people are just different, though, and this is an example of why you need to cut checks for certain guys because the ROI is insane. I think college basketball, I think the NBA pushes back on one. Baseball would be number one. Like the manager doesn't matter in 2025. The front office runs the teams and just based on the money. You know, a baseball manager makes like what a wide receiver coach in college football makes. But no one's ever argued in basketball in college. Calipari, Izzo. I mean, look at the coaches in the Sweet 16. Coach K forever, Boeheim. I think college basketball coaches were always really, really famous because they were really, really important. So I hear you. I don't think anyone. I think it's more the NBA. Now, a good coach matters in the NBA, but you would never remember the argument. There was like a sports talk radio argument about Brad Stevens or a top five player. This was like a decade ago. It's like, no, you would take the top player. But even like Eric Spoelstra, look at Eric Spoelstra. He has a bad team. They suck. Like you need good players. Like you need star players in basketball. Has Kyler Murray reached the ceiling, forever being a dynamic player that can't take his team to the next level? Or do we chalk his limitations up to poor coaching and the lack of supporting talent? I think he kind of is what he is. Um, I just think he's a pretty fickle player. If you catch him on the right day, he can beat anyone in the league. He can play a half of football that's as good as Mahomes or Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. When he's on individual drives, he is unstoppable. Scrambling around, making throws. I would say his talent level is really high, but his consistency level is really low. And only people around him can really tell, like, is it coaching? Is it just I do think whenever you're really short, and this is again the height thing. I heard David Andrews, I saw this clip, the former Patriots center. He's like, the thing that blows you away when you get to the NFL is how enormous, and he's like, when I came into the NFL, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Carson Palmer, Phillip Rivers, Eli Manning, Joe Flacco, how huge these quarterbacks are. I remember when I met Carson Palmer, I was like, is this guy an NBA player? He looks like 6'10". Now he was like 6'6", but he's so thick. These guys are huge. And for Kyler to be as good as he is at 5'9" is a testament to how elite his just athleticism is. And he's got a great arm too. Sometimes shorter guys, arm can be hit or miss. But yeah, I think he just kind of is what he is. Now I think the question is, can you stretch out his good football a little longer? But I don't think he'll ever be in the elite category. I think he can have an individual season that is pretty dynamic. Uh, that one, the one year when they should have probably won the division, but they blew it at the end. It was his best season with Cliff. Let's see if I can find his stats. Yeah, they went. He threw 24 touchdowns. He actually was really good to start his career. His second year, 26 and 12. Um, and another 11 touchdowns on the ground. His third year in 21, 24 touchdowns, 10 picks with five touchdowns on the ground. He's always giving you 5, 3, 3, 5. His 11 his 11 touchdown year is a little bit of an outlier. He actually he kind of gets sacked a lot. He missed a lot of games. So his first 2 years never got hurt. Second year missed a couple games. Third year, I think that's when he tears his ACL and then he comes back. He actually was durable last year, played in every game. They went 8-9. So he's fully healthy last year, 8-9, 68%. So he's pretty accurate. 21-11. They just I think he'd like a little more explosion on offense. I mean, that's why they drafted Marvin Harrison. I think he's kind of the worst spot. Like he's definitely better than a lot of guys, but is he good enough to be paying a ton of money and be your franchise quarterback? Probably not. But you could do way worse. Like, I mean, 8-9, some of those losses were definitely on him, but some of those wins were on him too. He's just he's a hard to player to kind of like describe, which is good and bad if you're a Cardinal fan. When it comes to college basketball and March Mania, one thing is for sure, nothing's for sure. Upsets, buzzer beaters, Cinderellas, top seeds going home early, it's all gonna happen. Bet the unexpected. Every upset, every day with DraftKings Sportsbook. With live betting, exclusive content, promos, and parlays, DraftKings is the ultimate college basketball destination for March. Ready to make your first bet? Check out matchups and pick a team to win. It's that simple. First time, here's something special just for you. New DraftKings customers bet 5 to get 200 in bonus bets instantly. Bet the unexpected with DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Use the code JOHN, that's John. That's code JOHN for new customers to get 200 in bonus bets when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. As a Seahawks fan, our GM has been heavily criticized for not taking linemen by many people in the fan base. Either he's not spending big money in free agency or whiffing on our offensive line draft picks. As a former scout, what are the most important aspects to look for in scouting interior offensive linemen? And do you agree with Schneider's free agent philosophy of not reaching for need? Well, when you reach in free agency, you got to pay a lot. So if I'm reaching for a guard, it's going to cost me $22 million a year. Look at the Packers. They just bought Aaron Banks. Aaron Banks is like an average starter at best, and they're paying a ton of money. So I'm not against his philosophy at all. I do think with guards and centers, your scheme matters. Now he's got Kubiak. They run a zone running scheme. So they're going to look for athletes more than power maulers. And the key with a guard or center in the, kind of the zone running scheme is being able to move your feet and positional block. Now, luckily, it's easier to find those guys than like Larry Allen or Logan Mankins or someone like that. But like I think a lot of people would tell you that the offensive line development in college has never been worse because when a guy's decent, he gets a bunch of money, he's moving schools, and his development is just I don't want to say it's been slowed or stopped, but it's not the same as it used to be. So it's more difficult to find. And then at the end of the day, like guards and centers, like D tackles, I think the number one thing you would hear talking to head coaches, GMs, coordinators, O line coaches, like toughness, toughness, mindset, toughness. The one thing you saw with that Eagles run is like Jurgen's back is not working. Dickerson's leg is like falling off, and he like wouldn't come out of the game. And then if I remember correctly, like did Jurgensen go back in the game when he didn't start? And then Dickerson is like these guys you got to be tough as nails to play guard and center. When I think of Jason Kelsey, or I'll never forget when I was a GA at Fresno State, Coach Hill had Jim Otto talk to the team. I've told this before. And he did like a Q&A after he gave like a pump up speech. I think he passed away pretty recently. And someone on the team asked him like the toughest player he ever went against. I mean, the Raiders were playing like Mean Joe Green every single year. In the peak of that rivalry, in the 70s, Mean Joe Green. I think widely considered one of, if not the best defensive tackles. They also played the Purple People Eaters in the Super Bowl they won. Pretty sure they had a guy named Deacon Jones. And Jim Otto said, by far the toughest guy that I've ever played against is the guy I see in the morning when I look in the mirror. I just think kind of like wrestlers, I need my guards and centers tough. And there's a different level of toughness in the NFL. And it's just hard to quantify. The Cardinals, joke of a franchise. You're not wrong, but they are my team. Play GM. What can they do to be relevant? I don't think they're a joke of a franchise in the sense of like they got a real Jonathan Gannon's a real coach. Uh, I I think they've they're not. It's more the owner. I think is not viewed very highly, but like from a football standpoint, like they got good players. They've been competitive the last couple of years with Kyler. They've had some moments, with Bruce Arians and Kime, like they were a real franchise. They were really good there for a couple of years. So I, I think anytime that you're just like, it almost feels like they're in a relationship. You're not going to marry her, but in a weird way, you're like living together. So you're essentially married and you can't really break up with her, but you're kind of stuck. You don't even like each other. It's almost like you're roommates. That's kind of the Kyler situation. I know they've spoken about it positively, but like I think we have to acknowledge like they're in this weird spot with him and it could get way worse. Like let's just say they traded him to whoever. Let's just say next offseason they trade him because they go 8-9 again and he has a similar season. They just trade him for like second round pick to move on and just reset. There's a chance they're way worse at quarterback for a while, but like that is not going to be good enough. Like think about the best two teams you've had. Carson Palmer was healthy, high end player. The 1 year with Kurt Warner, obviously Hall of Famer. But I think when you're in business with Kyler, it's just a tough spot because you're paying a premium, but you're not always getting a premium. This isn't a football question, but just curious on your take. I'm 24 years old. I'm aspiring film director, currently living in Nashville, but my lease expires in January. So often that I hear I should move to Los Angeles or New York in order to get my foot in the door in the industry. But I feel like maybe I don't fully grasp that advice. Moving somewhere does not automatically grant you success, does it? For people who give that kind of advice, what do you think what do you think are the actual tangible benefits to moving to one of these places? Actionable things that would allow me to have a plan before moving out there. Curious your thoughts. Lifelong Steelers fan, big fan. Well, congrats, man. Uh, Follow your dreams, bro. Do I'm being dead serious. That's really cool. Uh, Listen, I don't know the specifics on your industry. Forever it was like if you wanted to work in Hollywood, movies, TV, whatever, like people were moving to LA, aspiring actors and actresses just to do whatever they could to be in the vicinity of those humans. And I think I remember uh, 3 or 4 years ago, my brother's college roommate works for this big almond farmer, and this almond farmer had this huge party in the Fresno area, and he tried to get Stevie Nicks to come play. He couldn't, and he got Joan Jett instead. She was freaking awesome. This was like a party for like 2,000 people, and me and Jeff went. And he also had John Party, who's I don't want to say like a country music superstar, but he's a pretty big deal. I think he's pretty good. He's a country musician who's like legit and he also played the party. So it was him, and Joan Jett for a couple thousand people. And there was an after party that me and my brother got it, kind of like snuck our way into, because it was only like not that many people in Russell's office, and John Party was in there with some other people, and eventually everyone left, and it was just me, Jeff, John Party, and like a 12 pack, and we were just drinking, talking, and he told this story about when he was coming up, and he was from, kind of the Sacramento area. And this businessman who eventually told John, if you do not leave this area and move to Nashville, you might as well just go into construction or do something else. You will never make it. So he picked up and he left and he went to Nashville, and the rest is history. And I think the one thing he said is like, I just got to be around music producers, people in the industry. I could just meet, whether it through events or whether it was just playing places, and have those people attending. Now, in a situation like you, if you're a movie producer, right, or director, or you want to work in that world, part of quote unquote going to LA, do you just walk up to the three or four big production operations and knock on the door and try to get a job? Like, are you any more likely seeing those people because they work in an office? They're not out like recruiting in the town for someone like you. Or does it even matter? Can you just find a way to send your stuff to those people? Now, you could argue, do those people hold the same amount of power as they once did? Would it be more important to get in front of the guy at Netflix, of the guy at Amazon, of the guy on, whoever runs NBC's Peacock? And are you any more likely doing that through the internet than how are you ever going to get in front of these people? So I hear you. Like, it's easy to play devil's advocate and go, how do I get in front of this human being? And I would say in 2025, you'd have to be pretty specific, right? I don't think you would just knock on any door. And a lot of these people, the business is dramatically changing. You could also argue if you're able to find a way to produce, I don't know, your own little mini movies or whatever and put them on YouTube, you are able to create things now from anywhere in America that you can just send the link to those people through LinkedIn that you could hustle without being there. Uh, so I think there are pros and cons to it. I think 20, 30 years ago, you would have no choice. Like if you wanted to get into the industry, you would have to gravitate in your field to one of those places. You could argue in country music now, you don't have to move to Nashville right away. I could become a star on TikTok, on Instagram, and be discovered that way. I don't need to play on Broadway, right? So I think the world's changed because of the internet. Now I don't exactly know your story of like, are you already producing stuff that's already available that I could click on a link, or have you not done anything and you just have ideas down? Because if you're at that stage, you probably would want to get some sort of mentorship working for someone. But in my experience, like I could never have made it to the NFL if I did not get the opportunity to work at Fresno State. And the way I got my cousin had played there. He's a long snapper. But during spring break, 1 year, I had been calling around, tried to get a gig. I just drove to Fresno and went up to the office and met the guy, and that's how our kind of relationship started. So sometimes in a world of like emails and DMs and all that stuff, there is, value to meeting people. Why couldn't you just, I don't know, your financial situation, just go to LA or New York, rent the cheapest hotel possible, spend a week, and just go knock on some doors or attack it that way as a person instead of moving out there. So I would argue in 2025, the old school, I got to go there, uh, is not as important as it once was, but there always is a value of, I don't know, being in the vicinity of a human being. I think, is there any sort of convention, like for football, for example, the combine, things like that, where people trying to get involved, coaching, clinics and things where people go to meet people, shake hands, develop and network. I would say those things are pretty important that don't force you to move. Um, but I don't think your career just ends if you don't move there by any means. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that, like, I don't think necessarily you have to go, but there are a lot of variables that I don't know about your situation to for me to like give you advice. Uh, I do think, when I first got into the media, when I was doing radio, the more events I went to, the more people I met, and the more my life just, or my career, my professional life expanded. So when I first left football in 13 and for like 14, 15, 16, constantly going to obviously Niners and Raiders practices, but I went to a ton of Warrior games. I went to a ton of Giants games. I was just around. So there's always a benefit, and it's not apples to apples to your question, but just being around, especially if you're young. That's the other thing you got going for you. You're young. It gets harder. Once you get my age, it's easy to be like, yeah, I'm not that interested in doing that. When you're young, assuming you're single, kind of times on your side, opportunities on your side. And like I said, even if you don't need to move, just like look at some shitty hotel, scrape together, see if you can, if you can get a couple $100 and just, I guess you got to fly there too. But hell, maybe you can take the bus and just go for like a week and just go guerrilla warfare. you map out a plan. Like I need to meet again. I don't know your industry. These three or four people. Even if I meet their assistants, right, or someone in their vicinity, how do I just make an impression? Like 30-second elevator pitch. Even if I only get in front of one of the five people with connection to that person. As an Eagles fan, I was sad to see Milton Williams go, but I get there was no way Philly was going to pay him that. That said, do you think they'll pay Jalen Carter if he has another year like the one, and what will he cost? The answer is yes, and a lot of money. If he keeps playing like he's playing, he'll be one of, if not the highest paid players in the league. And his agent, Rosenhaus, now he's done a lot of deals with Howie, but it will not come cheap. So I would say an astronomical amount of money. I think ideally the Eagles probably would play it out 4 years. It'd be interesting. If he has another sweet year, he's like an all pro. Will he want to get paid after his third year? Question for the pod. Do you think there is a higher chance that one of the second tier quarterbacks, Gabriel, McCord, Dart, in this year's draft, has more success if they go to a better situation in the later rounds than Ward or Sanders in the first? Of course. I would imagine if we look back on the draft, uh, a ton of the second tier guys become really good players. I mean, think about some of the starters over the last decade. Purdy, seventh round pick, great situation. Dak Prescott, fourth round pick, great situation. Cousins, fourth round pick, not a great situation, but kind of worked out. Russell Wilson, third round pick. Like, what if you're Jackson Dart and you go to the Rams and you go to the Rams and you get to sit for a year behind Stafford and the next year start? That's a much better situation than the Titans or the Giants. I'm sure this idea has been considered, maybe even tried, but I can't for the life of me think why the current NFL rules someone wouldn't try this. Imagine having a uniquely tall player, someone like Shaq, playing tight end. I would just tell that player to run 5 yards, turn around, have the quarterback throw the ball high enough, only the tight end could grab it. How would that not be unstoppable? Again, I can't imagine this idea has never been considered, but I'm curious as your take. Still battling this cold flu thing. It's just my the cold flu in 2025, Hall of Famer. I mean, talk about packing a punch. I would imagine it's been discussed. That guy, let's just pick a 7 footer, even if he's not as big as Shaq, but let's Kevin Garnett, Anthony Davis. Okay, he runs 5 yards, turns around. There's never been an easier human to tackle. And I'm taking you out of your legs. Like, you're going to get injured. So I think it's, in theory, it's easy to say it out loud and kind of make some success. But part of being a good tight end, Kelsey, Kittle, Mark Andrews, whoever, you know, Gronk, Tony Gonzalez, Shannon Sharp, you're like great with the ball in your hands. You make moves, you can run routes. Uh, so, like, do those guys have the change of direction at their height? And I also think they're very, very easy to tackle. So I think that's a problem. Very easy to tackle. And how fast are they, right, relative to NFL players? I think there's a certain height as an NFL player that actually is a disadvantage. That would be my just take. I haven't thought that much about it. I hear what you're saying, and maybe it'd be effective, but just you're going to have a roster spot for a guy that just runs 4 or 5 yard routes. Because you're right. If you can throw, can the guy catch? If you think about most of the tight ends that have been basketball players, they've actually been short relative to basketball players, right? They're like 6'3" to 6'5". Antonio Gates. I'm a fan of Ryan Poles and what he has been able to build in Chicago. The wins haven't been there, but this may be the best team we've had since the Lovey days. While he's had some misses, Claypool, Nate Davis, he has great hits, and that has given the Bears their best shot at relevancy. While our team has been tailored to fit Ben Johnson's style, Poles hasn't been getting the credit I think he deserves. It seems as though everyone has given the credit to Ben, as if he's building out the roster himself. I don't doubt the role Ben Johnson is most likely playing in the roster moves, but I feel that the guy who is negotiating and making them happen deserves more credit. Or am I wrong? And Poles has had his role diminished with the Ben Johnson show. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the carryover from last year. So the stink of the previous season, they fired Eberflus in Thanksgiving, right? They so the coach has been out of sight, out of mind for so long that the hype of last year a lot revolved around Ryan Poles. I considered it the greatest trade in the history of sports for what he got from Carolina. And then the season, you're like, well, still pretty good trade. You would redo it, but it's like we still got to let this thing play out. How well it works out for the Bears. And listen, he definitely has not been bad. Like they had a lot of talent on the field last year, and now with their offensive line, it's much better. And I'm with you. I mean, with how bad their offensive line was, whether Ben Johnson was their coach or me or you was their coach, they were going to trade for some offensive line help or sign offensive line help. But I do think, listen, the Caleb thing was the easiest thing to ever do, right? And he didn't even entertain drafting the other guys. Shouldn't he have like been seriously entertaining Jaden Daniels and Drake May? Shouldn't he have brought them in? And he never did. And then the Rome Odunze pick, I like Rome. I am pro Rome Odunze, but like the Bears should have not drafted Rome Odunze. They should have drafted an offensive lineman, and there were a ton on the board, and that's a big mistake. So I do think the Caleb thing, like a lot of pressures on Caleb, and if Jaden continues to play well, like you could have taken him. So I'm not going to say it's over. They played one season, but that one season, it's not like Jaden Daniels played on some loaded team. When scouting running backs, how do you weigh the double-edged sword of strength of schedule versus mileage? Jeanty played in the Mountain West and didn't face top defensive talent, but also probably has more gas in the tank due to not facing SEC defensive linemen. Does it all even out and make conference irrelevance for mid to top tier running backs? P.S. Can we get a save it or shave it for Jed York? Yeah, I mean it's really really hard because when you excel in the Big Ten or the SEC as a running back, you are playing a ton of NFL defensive players. Like I'm pro Shador Sanders, but the success he had playing quarterback in the Big 12 was not against a lot of NFL players. And while the Big 12 is a Power Four conference, from a talent standpoint, it's not great on defense. So, how many defensive linemen, linebackers, and corners are you playing that are going to go to the NFL? So you're evaluating them. It's like, well, these aren't NFL players. Well, when you play in the SEC or the Big Ten, like every single week, you're playing a bunch of NFL players. So it's an easier evaluation. There's no right or wrong way to do it because we've seen a lot of guys not playing big conferences and go on to excel in the NFL. But I think like if you just expect Jeanty to like break all these tackles against Fred Warner and Luke Kuechly, and it's like I know Luke's retired, but you know what I mean. It's probably not going to happen. So like the dominance and his, I remember a scout texting me during the season. They're like, his highlight tape is stupid, and you just go to YouTube, type in Ashton Jeanty 2024. He looks like a video game player. I do think some of those, no one's arguing his talent. He is a elite talent. He's a special talent. But like the guys he's doing it against aren't a bunch of NFL guys. So I don't have a great answer for you. I think you put more stock into when guys excel at the highest level against the best players. And if you dominate on offense in the SEC, you're going to be pretty good on offense, probably. Like Brock Bowers, unstoppable in the SEC, pretty good in the NFL. Like that, it's usually sometimes in college, you never really know, right? In Mountain West or, when the Pac 12 was down, it's kind of hit or miss. You're taking an educated guess. So Ashton Jeanty could be a Pro Bowler. Like it wouldn't shock me if you tell me he makes two Pro Bowls, and it wouldn't shock me at all if you say he never makes a Pro Bowl. When Saquon came out, it went like this guy's a Pro Bowl talent. I would say the same thing about Bijan Robinson. Now there are other variables, how well your teams run, all that stuff, but like you watch, these guys are freak shows. Like I don't put Jeanty on that level. Same thing with McCaffrey. Like, wait, this guy can play receiver and he's like a dominant inside runner as well. How's this not going to work? Well, injuries. Because when he's healthy, he dominates. Okay, last question. What are the realistic expectations for Arch Manning? The Quinn Ewers era had moments, but the definition of highs and lows. My expectations aren't that high. Now, the team is going to be stacked, and I think year one, he can play like a J.J. McCarthy type role. Now, he's a better athlete than J.J. McCarthy, but one thing I think people don't quite understand, and maybe it improves dramatically this offseason, he does not have some huge arm. So, like when you watch Cam Ward or Caleb Williams or Jaden, Drake May, like they were throwing seeds. I think Arch is much more closer to Peyton than he is Eli in terms of arm strength. So I think the hype on Arch is outrageous. Anything less than like superstardom is going to feel like a letdown. I think it's going to be a little difficult. So my expectation, I think he's going to be a good player. This team's so stacked. Like I wouldn't just put all my money on him being the future number one overall pick based on what I saw him throwing the ball, velocity. Now it's not the end all be all, but he plays in the SEC. So over the next, assuming he's going to play at minimum a couple years in college, which I would expect, play next year and then another year. He's going to be playing a lot of NFL players at LSU, at Alabama, at A&M, at Georgia, at Florida. Like he's going up against the cream of the crop. So we're going to know, right? And yeah, I would say my expectations this upcoming year are tempered. And I honestly feel it's like unfair. The hype on this guy might be the biggest ever because of the buildup of his family name. Other guys, they just got to play. So, like the hype on whoever, Tebow or Caleb Williams or Luck, happened as they were playing. It was like, oh, this is the greatest prospect of all time, Trevor Lawrence. But it was like while they were playing. All this hype on Arch Manning, it's like he's what, had a couple spot starts for Quinn Ewers? He's barely played. Came in against Georgia in a blowout. Like it's tough. Really good athlete. Arm strength, I got to see it. I got to see it. And I mean, I think he's just talked about like he's the future number one overall pick. Now, size, check. Clearly, character, high level cat, like the way teammate. The way, I've read articles. Clearly, an impressive guy. How he throws it, I'm fascinated to see. He's in an incredible spot. I mean, the team over the next couple of years is going to be its southern version of Ohio State. Unlimited money, sweet roster, skilled dudes. So he's got awesome play caller. He's in an incredible spot. But the hype for a guy that's it's hard. I mean, for every Cooper flag, it's like the hype, the hype, the hype. Then he shows up, you're like, Jesus. And then he just dominates number one overall pick. There are a lot of people that go the other way. And I think the factor like Arch, a huge part of his hype, which was out of his control, was just his name. Would he have been this? Would we be discussing him if his name was Arch Johnson, Arch Arch Williamson, Arch Middlekauff? No chance. No chance. Doesn't mean he can't become a great player, but I don't know. I'm excited. Like I can't wait to watch him. I'm big fan of the Manning family, but I think the hype. I mean, it feels like he's talked about like he's just a better player than like all the number one picks over the last like 15 years. Anything less than Arch being like consensus number one pick feels like it's going to be a disappointment. That's all I'm saying. I feel like it's unfair. How's he going to live up to that? I don't know. Adios.